morning. Thank you for that music. I love this. Yeah, this is a neat experience. To be able to come in and enjoy that kind of music. And Glenn was reminding me just it creates an atmosphere. It creates a sense of okay, let's listen, which helps. That's right, riding on a wave. The ideas for today's message, freedom, came. Artist, as usual, a little more than a month before I'm supposed to be speaking, calls and asks for a topic. He said, "What's the topic going to be?" And I'm like, okay, I haven't thought of a topic yet. So I looked at the calendar and I realized it was March 13th, 2 days shy of March 15th, which is the Ides of March. If you remember the play by Shakespeare about Julius Caesar, as he was walking towards the Senate, someone approached him and said, "Beware the Ides of March." And of course, for him that day, it was true. He needed to beware the Ides of March. But since that time and before that, it's taken on kind of a superstition. A day that's, kind of like Friday the 13th, beware, like this. When there's really no power in that whatsoever in that day or any other day. But it's a superstition that we can find ourselves holding to. And superstition can be a very debilitating and limiting factor in our lives, a very debilitating thing that we hold to. Went to the dictionary again. The definition of superstition is a belief or practice resulting from ignorance, resulting from fear of the unknown, or resulting from a false sense of causation. In other words, I believe that if I step on a line, I'll break my mother's spine. Or if I walk under a ladder, somehow I'll be, all kinds of stuff will happen. If a black cat crosses my path, watch out. So a false sense of causation, that somehow these things have power to change the circumstances of my life. And when I find myself practicing superstitions, I end up giving up a lot of my freedom. Freedom to create my life, freedom to do and to be who I am and all that I am, because I stop like, well, wait a minute, does that break some rule? Does that put me in a place where I could be damaged or this kind of stuff? And so, and what I'd like to do this morning is look at a time in our history where we overcame a big superstition to go on to become free and independent. This is a different kind of source this morning. I don't know if we've ever used the Declaration of Independence as a material for a message in the morning. It's not from a patriotic sense. It's not from a rah-rah, whatever, but an object lesson to see, again, what it took for us to get to the point where we could declare independence, become free people in this country. The move to freedom had several different things that motivated us, that got us to the place where we were willing to become free. For a long time, we had a really nice little existence. Great Britain even let us have representative houses in each state so that we could play a part in our own government. And help make decisions and those kind of things. We had an economy with a ready and demanding market for all of our goods and services. So we had money coming in. We had an economy, and we also had protection. The greatest army and navy in the world were watching over us, and we had this protection. But we always were subjects. We always were subjects to the King of England. And so when the bottom line came down, we didn't make a lot of decisions about who we were going to be or what we were going to do. It was dictated for us. And we lived okay with that for a while. It's like, okay, we're safe. Everything is okay, and this is going to be all right. And then somewhere along in the early to mid 1760s, Great Britain decided they wanted to make a little money off the colonies. They had spent a bunch of money fighting the French and Indian War, and their coffers were starting to get a little lower, so they said, you know what, we need to start taxing those folks over in America, those colonies, and start generating some revenue from us. Of course, as you know, there was some very vehement and very principled opposition to those types of ideas. If you remember the Boston Tea Party from your grade school and teachings and such. And so we said no, and not just no, but this is not going to be allowed to happen. And so Great Britain tried to repeal those and try to dress it up in a different outfit and make the tax look like something more palatable to us. And we said, no, this is not going to work. And all along, the king is trying to take control of the colonies. And it got worse and worse. Finally, inevitably, more British troops were sent over Great Britain is going to take control of us, and they're going to be in charge. And armed clashes started to happen, and fights and battles and such. And the colonists were looking at this and saying, this isn't right. This isn't right. We swore allegiance to this king because we were going to be protected by this king. What's going on? This is not how we saw the picture. This is not how we thought it was going to be. And yet, when they met in the First Continental Congress in 1774, they came together, and the majority of the people wanted to reconcile, wanted to stay together, wanted to maintain that connection to Great Britain, and to maintain that oneness with them for several reasons. And so they prevailed, and we kept trying to figure out some way to bring about. But again, the king kept pushing the envelope and doing things. And finally, in 1775, the Second Congress met, and again, the majority was still saying, you know what? We need to stay here. We don't need to be getting independent. There were some, John Adams and such, Jefferson, that wanted to have it that way, but the majority were saying, not this. And you got to look and say, what caused that? Why in the world were we so loath to declare independence? And there were a lot of reasons, but one of the things I would like to suggest, the big reason for that, came out in early 1776. Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. And in that pamphlet, he pointed out and let us see exactly what it was, a big part of what it was that was holding us back from declaring independence. What he said was, and made us realize, is that we had sworn allegiance to this king. We had signed an oath of allegiance under the name of God and said, we will follow the king. And the reason we did that is because we believed that God had created us incapable of governing ourselves. We believed that God had created us incapable of governing our lives and creating our lives by ourselves. We needed a king. And God, in God's benevolence, created a race of people, the kings and the sovereigns, queens of the land, to make it safe for us and to make it right for us. And if we were going to walk away from that, we would be walking away from God. And what Thomas Paine tried to point out was go back into the Old Testament and see where the idea of king came from. And he talked about Gideon, and Gideon, the children of Israel wanted to make him king. And Gideon said, it's not that I'm going to deny your request to be your king. What I want to tell you is you don't have the right to say anybody else is king other than God. And so they went back, okay, and they lived for a while. And then finally they got to the place where they saw their neighbors and they had kings. And they seemed to be doing really well. They had kings, and that was neat. They had a king. It was kind of cool. And they had this. And so they said, we want a king. We want it. And so, again, Thomas Paine points out the fallacy that somehow God created the idea of a king. And God created this race of people that was going to take care of us and relieve us of our obligation, or relieve us of our responsibility and ability to take care of our own lives. And so finally, when the people started reading that and started looking at this whole idea of their allegiance that they'd sworn to the king, their minds started opening up to the idea, well, maybe we could be independent. Maybe we could be free. Maybe we could live free and govern our own lives, govern ourselves, be responsible for creating our own lives, our own nation. And so they started moving towards that. And again, the Declaration of Independence. In the Declaration of Independence, it says, we therefore state that we are and of right ought to be free and independent colonies, independent states. And it says, absolved of all allegiances to the king. Absolved of all allegiances to the king. Absolution, if you're familiar with the Catholic Church or other religious bodies, absolution is the releasing of releasing from a commitment or releasing from the guilt or the consequences of an act. And so what he's saying is, and because it was such a personal thing, it was such a deeply embedded idea, he's saying that he had to use this language to let us know we are absolved. We don't have to keep believing this way. We don't have to hold on to this belief anymore. Just because we believed it all of our lives up till this point, we don't have to hold on to that. We don't have to keep doing that. We can think differently. We can have a different idea about what life's about and what we can do with our lives. And so they declared independence. And what they had to do is amazing. What they had to do was create a whole different picture of who God was. They had to create a whole different picture of how God interacted with human beings. And they had to create in their lives a whole different picture of who they were. Because before this, they thought, I can't do it. I'm not capable. God has created me incapable of creating my life. God has created me. I need to look to somebody else to tell me what to do. I need to look to somebody else to tell me how to live and what is truth. And so they had to take a step of faith, a leap of faith, and say, okay, we can do this ourselves. We can be responsible for ourselves. And so their picture of God had to change in the sense that God was not this small being that created us weak and incapable of creating our own lives, and also looking differently at ourselves, that we are not these small beings that we've pictured ourselves to be and believed ourselves to be all this time. And so they threw off that superstition. They threw off that faulty belief, that faulty allegiance to an idea that somehow this is how God works. And that was a big step in our lives. And again, it's taken off and had an impact throughout the world as a result. But this letting go of superstitions, and in each of us, I think, has had that experience in our lives where we've had to take a look at who God is in our mind, what spirit, what life is in our minds and in our lives, and say, is that adequate? Is that really the truth? Is that really what it is? We maybe come from faiths where we were, yes sir, 3 bags full, and we were confined to listening and to looking to somebody else to tell us what the truth is and tell us how things worked. And so we, again, had some superstitions that we held to. It's like, I have to do this to earn God's kindness. I had to do this to earn God's love and benevolence, and do things a certain way. I had to kneel at a certain time and this kind of thing, or whatever it was. And so all of us have had to make these changes in our lives to let the picture of God, and I hope for myself that it's a lifelong change. That today the limited, as much as I have seen an expansion of this idea of who God is, this idea of what life is and who I can be, as much as I've seen that, I'm hoping that next year this time I will look back and say, boy, I was really limited in my view, and I've really grown and expanded in that idea. I've let go of some of these superstitions that I didn't realize I was holding on to. Some of these beliefs about myself, some of these beliefs about other people, some of these beliefs about how spirit works in the world and what is possible in the world. And one of 3 of the, Jefferson talks in his autobiography about 3 of the consistently spoken of superstitions that we see as the human condition. It's written out, the same 3 ideas are brought about in the Old Testament. Solomon taught, when he was going to figure out life, he said, well, I'm going to become as wise as I can be. Well, that didn't work. Well, I'm going to have all the fun I want and do whatever I want, and that didn't work. He said, well, I'm going to build and be rich and have everything I need, and that didn't work. And then in the New Testament, in 1 John, it says that the problem is the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. In other words, reliance on the physical, reliance on wanting, and then of knowing. And Jefferson himself wrote in his autobiography about the same superstition. So I want to take a look at those and see how they can have a place, can we can stumble over these as well. In his autobiography, early in his career, he was a part of the Virginia legislature. And early on, and rather somewhat naively, he made a motion to them in the state of Virginia that to abolish slavery. To abolish slavery back in the late 1760s, early 1770s. He made a motion that he wanted slavery abolished. And of course it didn't pass, it didn't work. The motion failed and it went on. And Jefferson's observation of why it didn't work is very interesting. He wrote in his autobiography, "Our minds were circumscribed within narrow limits." Isn't that a neat way to say we're narrow-minded? Our minds were circumscribed within narrow limits by an habitual belief that it was our duty to be subordinate to the mother country in all matters of government, to direct all our labors in subservience to her interests, and even to observe a bigoted intolerance for all religions but hers. And he goes on to say, the difficulties with our representatives, the difficulties with these people who were making these decisions, were of habit and despair, not of reflection and conviction. In other words, they were in a habit of thinking this way. They were in a habit of seeing life a certain way, and they couldn't stretch themselves beyond that paradigm. They couldn't stretch themselves beyond that belief. And the three areas, the three different types of superstition, if you will, or faulty allegiances that he talks about. First of all, in the first paragraph, he says, we believe that it was our duty to be subservient to the mother country in all matters of government. That we need perfect security. Basically, that we need perfect security. Again, the whole idea of the lust of the flesh, the whole idea of in the New Age writing, it calls it perfect security, the craving or the addiction to perfect security. The fact that I need to be perfectly safe to be okay. That to really know God, if I'm really going to live life perfectly, I need to have perfect security. I need to have all my needs met and everything else that I want, because if I don't, then life just won't be complete. And so he's saying that the reason they held to their beliefs was because they wanted to stay safe in the hands of Great Britain. They wanted that perfect security, and without it, they felt they would lose their lives. They felt they would lose all meaning and all purpose in their lives. The lure of perfect security can be a mirage, and a strong mirage. I'm not suggesting we throw caution to the wind and just say, que sera, whatever. But there is a reasonable, and sometimes probably more radical than we'd like to think, but a reasonable way of looking at how to live our lives, what challenges, what chances to take in our lives if we wanted to see it to grow and to see it become all that it can be. I had an experience back in 2004. I had taken a severance package from a company I was working for, and it allowed me to live for several months on that package and take a sabbatical, take some time off to do some study and reading and relaxing. And it was getting close to, it's about 6 months into it, and the money was starting to run out, and I was looking and I thought, I could live on this for about 2 months more before I had to go get a job, or I could take the vacation I've always wanted to take instead, and that was a baseball vacation. Baseball's, that's my fun. I've been to all the stadiums that are and so I wanted to take a baseball vacation. And I sat back and I looked and I said, the safe thing to do would be to get a job and make sure I had a regular source of income and then take a vacation. Because without that, it's pretty risky, because I was looking at not having as much money when I got back to live on until I found a job. But I decided to go for it. I decided I was going to go ahead, and so I went online and started booking tickets and booking airlines and such like that. Flew up to Philadelphia, drove to Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Baltimore, Detroit, and New York for baseball games in a 2-week span. And the neat thing the very telling thing that happened is I would sit in the box seats. I made sure I got tickets in the close to home plate, whatever, and the real baseball fans. I mean, the people that are willing to spend money and to see baseball are there. And so I tell them about what I was doing. You know, hey, I'm taking this baseball vacation. I took the chance. I'm going to go out and have some fun. And most of the time, what happened was these people would look at me and said, I've always wanted to do that. I've always wanted to do that. And they all provided reasons why they didn't. They all provided reasons why they didn't follow up on what they really wanted to do. And most of them had to do, a lot of them had to do with being safe. It didn't fit in their picture of themselves. It didn't fit in their picture of how big life was. And so they avoided it, and they didn't do it. And so perfect security, this idea that we need to be perfectly safe, can limit us, can debilitate us, and keep us from really knowing life as big as it can be. The next one he talks about, he says, we thought it was our responsibility to direct all our labors in subservience to her interests, to England's interests. The next one is perfect romance. The addiction or the craving for perfect romance. The need to have everything just wonderful. If you remember First Love, it's like, oh, they're perfect. They're perfect. Look at everything about them is perfect. And I want to put all my energy and all my activity into just paying attention to them. And they're going to do the same. They're going to put all their attention and energy into focusing on me. And life is just perfect. And wow, this is just wonderful. And at 13, that's okay. You know, that's okay. At 13 years old, that's okay. The problem happens when we try to perpetuate that, when we try to circumscribe, again, our minds and within narrow limits to try to push out any recognition that things aren't perfect, and push out any recognition that maybe that life happens. And that we create it, and yet there are things that again, it's not a perfect romance. In relationships with our significant others or spouses, whatever, that it's not always a perfect romance. That there are things to work through and to talk through, and things to deal with, and life is not a perfect romance. And if we are caught up in wanting to make sure that it is, then we're necessarily going to limit ourselves from our involvement in life. We're going to find somewhere where we can make life small enough to be perfect, or delude ourselves enough, if you will, to believe that, look, it's perfect, it's wonderful, and so it can be a debilitating superstition or debilitating allegiance, if you will, to get caught up in that. And finally, he says the third one, he says, and we thought we were responsible to observe a bigoted intolerance for all religions but hers, for all religions but England's. The idea of perfect serenity, of being right. This whole idea that I can get to the place where I know all truth. I can get to the place where I know everything there is to know and I believe rightly. And so I cannot be disturbed, I cannot be upset because I know and I'm right. This whole idea that we can actually understand all things or know all truth. Bill Bryson, in his book, The Short History of Nearly Everything, talks about Albert Einstein. And at one point in Albert Einstein's career, he believed that the universe was a static experience, that it was not an expanding universe, but that it was a static universe. And later on in his life, he came to realize, oh, I was wrong. It is an expanding, as people started studying and such, they came to believe that, oh, it is an expanding universe. So if Albert Einstein can get to the point where he realizes, oh, I didn't know the truth, how much more for us to be able to be open to say, from my best understanding, this is how life works. From my best understanding, this is how it's supposed to be. But they could discover something else tomorrow And it could change things. It could change the way I see certain things. It could change the way my understanding of how life works. And there's a freedom in that. There's a freedom in that. And there's a power for living in that. Because if I'm caught up in being right, again, I've necessarily circumscribed my mind within narrow limits to say, I don't see anything. I don't see it. I'm right. This is how it works. And everything I see and everything I interpret, I see through those glasses. And I say, oh, well, that means that. Well, the truth is that that's not necessarily what it means, but if I've convinced myself that I know all things and I'm right, then I've lost out on the chance to explore, the chance to discover. Again, we're more than we know. We're more than we know we are, or we can even perceive right now, conceive of who we are as human beings. And if we get caught up, we let ourselves be caught up in this whole idea that I need perfect security or I need perfect romance, perfect serenity, this whole thing of just knowing perfectly, we never get to discover who we are and more of who we are. And so freedom is the lack of allegiances, the letting go of these faulty allegiances, the ability to learn, the ability to evolve, if you will, in our understanding and in our expression of life, to being who we are and all that we can be. And it's based on an idea. It's based on a picture of God that says God is big enough to create us, capable of creating our own lives. God is big enough to create us, capable of creating our own lives. And we are capable, as a race, we are capable of creating our lives. And as we go through our lives, that idea, that image can grow and expand continually if we'll let it, if we'll invest ourselves in it. Again, we're more than we know. And if we'll take that time and be open to discovering what more there might be, life can be a real adventure. Yay, God.